Ok, on va commencer maintenant. So I'll start with a brief introduction in French and then I'll switch to English. So just hold on if you don't understand. Alors, bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue. Je m'appelle Rabbi, je suis membre de Voix juive indépendante à Montréal et je fais le texte pour l'événement aujourd'hui. Alors, vous pouvez voir qu'on a le Q&A. Si vous avez des questions, vous pouvez le mettre là. Vous pouvez mettre n'importe quoi dans la présentation et après, Professeur Rabkin a fini. On va prendre les questions et Fabienne, notre modératrice, va les poser. So yeah, my name is Rowan Guedet. I'm a member of Independent Jewish Voices Montreal. I'm doing the tech for today's event. And you'll see at the bottom that there's a Q&A section. So if you have questions, you can put them in whenever during the presentation. And once Professor Rabkin has finished the presentation, we'll be collecting them and Fabienne, as our moderator, will be posing them. So without further ado, Fabienne.
Merci, Rowan. Alors, bienvenue à tout le monde. On vous accueille avec grand plaisir à notre webinaire avec Yakov Rabkin, webinaire juif contre le sionisme depuis le Bund au Satmar jusqu'à aujourd'hui. We welcome you to another IJV webinar today with Yakov Rabkin. The webinar today is Jews Against Zionism from Bund to Satmar to now. Just so that you know, the webinar will be in English. Yakov will be presenting in English. And I will also be doing a little bit of intro in French as well as in English. And all questions and answers, please, can be in either language. So, je m'appelle Fabienne Présente et je suis membre juif séfarade de Voix juive Montréal. Je suis membre depuis longue date. Et je suis très, très heureuse qu'on aborde cette question aujourd'hui. Surtout que c'est une question assez épineuse, la question de l'anti-sionisme. Et c'est souvent un sujet traumatisant pour beaucoup de juifs. Pour moi, le passage vers l'antisionisme a débuté avec ma rencontre avec un Palestinien et tout bonnement parce que j'ai réalisé que ce Palestinien était un être humain. Pour moi, c'est ça qui a commencé un très long voyage, je dirais, un très long voyage vers, je dirais, l'antisionisme. So personally, I'm really, really glad that we're able to have this discussion. It's a very difficult question for many, many Jews. It is, however, a discussion that is extremely important to have. Let me introduce you a little bit. Let me introduce Yakov, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for a few years now. And Yakov is a founding member of IJV Canada and a very active member of IJV Montreal. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of Montreal, where he has taught since 1973. He is the author of over 300 articles and many books. Among them are What is Modern Israel? And A Threat from Within, a Century of Jewish Opposition to Zionism. For me, Yakov is a steadfast believer in asking the questions that as Jews, we are not supposed to ask, to question what is often unquestionable. He delves into Jewish history and present-day Jewish reality. And for me, his work empowers all of us who have taken the steps towards becoming Jews against Zionism. And his work gives us the tools with which to fight the battles against Israeli Hasbara and against the IHRA redefinition of anti-Semitism. And one last thing I want to say, non-Zionist Jews have a community. We are a very real Jewish community. And if IJV exists today, it's because we believe in this community. Yakov, que je connais depuis quelques années maintenant, est un des membres fondateurs de Voix juive indépendante Canada et il est également membre très actif de Voix juive Montréal. professeur émérite à l'UDM, à l'Université de Montréal, où il enseigne l'histoire depuis 1973. Il est auteur de au-delà de 300 articles et livres. Et le titre de ces livres, je vous en offre deux. C'est Comprendre l'État d'Israël, l'idéologie, religion et société, et Au nom de la Torah, une histoire de l'opposition juive au sionisme. Son travail sur l'histoire juive et les réalités juives actuelles nous soutiennent. Il nous aide dans la grande traversée qui est, je dirais, une grande traversée pour devenir des juifs contre le sionisme. Son travail nous permet de nous outiller pour mieux lutter contre l'idéologie sioniste, le Hasbara israélien, et contre la redéfinition de l'antisémitisme proposé par l'IRA. En dernier, je voudrais simplement souligner que nous avons, les Juifs non sionistes, une communauté. C'est une vraie communauté juive. Et si Voix juive indépendante Canada existe aujourd'hui, c'est parce qu'on y croit. Avant que je présente Yakov, je voudrais simplement dire quelques mots sur Voix juive Canada. Just a few words before Yakov's presentation about IJV, which is a growing grassroots organization opposing all forms of racism, advocating peace and justice in Israel-Palestine, and actively engaged in Palestinian solidarity. IJV exists all across Canada. We have many university chapters as well. And you will find us at www.ijvcanada.org. Et le webinaire aujourd'hui a lieu sur les territoires non cédés des Ghana-Gahake. And with this, Yakov, I pass the mic over to you. Thank you.
Merci, Fabienne. Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening if you're far away. I would like to speak for about half an hour. That's what has been allotted to me. And the topic of Jewish opposition to Zionism for many people, including many Jews, is an oxymoron. It just can't happen. It's like boiling snow. These things just don't exist. And I think this is the prevalent opinion today. And that's why it's so important to see the history of both Zionism and how Jews reacted to Zionism. And most of the things I'm going to tell you were in fact articulated by Zionists themselves, by the organizers of that movement. To begin with, Zionism was a revolution. It was a real departure from Jewish life as it was had been known for many centuries. And one should not confuse political Zionism, which is the topic of today, with biblical and Talmudic references to, and actually daily prayers that refer to return to the Holy Land. Because those prayers are what they are. They are prayers. They do not constitute a political program. In fact, the Talmud contains warnings about occupying the land by military means, by rebelling against the nations, and so on. So for the Zionists, the idea of formulating a political project was a very daring idea. I must say that it began not with Jews, but rather with the Protestants. I think that I wanted to share the screen, but for some reason it's host disabled screen sharing. Well, I hope the host will enable me to share the screen.
How about now? Is it better now?
Yeah, now it's better, yeah. Yeah. So this is actually the cover of the Hebrew edition of my book on Jewish opposition to Zionism. It came out in 15 languages now, including in Israel, where it was quite warmly received, because in Israel, everyone knows about it. You see, if in Montreal, Toronto, or Moscow, most people would be appalled by the existence of Jewish opposition to Zionism, in Israel, everyone knows that there are certain areas of the country where Zionism and the state of Israel are practically unpronounceable. So we have this, I would say, divorce between Israel and Jewish diasporas in the sense that this is not a taboo subject in Israel at all. And I had multiple opportunities to speak about it, to present my book there in Hebrew, and including actually on the radio station of the settlers, who were also very curious about this phenomenon. So what is Zionism? Before we talk about opposition, we have to define what we are talking about. Zionism is a political movement which started with the Protestants in the 17th century, where certain, I would say, marginal preachers started discussing the issue of returning the Hebrews to the Holy Land in order to speed the second coming of Christ. So the idea of Christian Zionism is a religious program using political means in order to speed the second coming of Christ. You can understand that that program didn't appeal to many Jews. And it remained more or less a dead letter. It was discussed among Protestants, particularly in English-speaking countries. It acquired some visibility in Britain in mid-19th century, but Jews remained either indifferent or totally ignorant of this idea. Tremendous changes had to happen in Jewish communities in Europe, and it is entirely a European project. In order for Zionism to become somewhat known. What are those changes? There are two large phenomena: acculturation and emancipation. Jews started leaving closed communities. They started learning the language of the country. And finally, with Napoleonic reforms, emancipation descended on most of Central and Western Europe. So Jews became technically equal citizens, and they became French citizens and German citizens and so on, of Jewish confession, of Jewish persuasion. In fact, the word Jewish was even dropped. For example, in France, it was more polite to say les Français Israélites rather than Jews. But in any case, there were tremendous changes. Jews entered the general society, they acquired general education, they became prominent in certain areas in the economy and culture. And this acculturation and emancipation continued throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, with the tragic interruption of the 12 years of Nazi rule in Europe. There was one country, or rather one area, the Russian Empire, where emancipation didn't happen, where Jews were not quite equal citizens. Most of them had to live in isolated areas, and that what's called a Pale of Settlement, which is more or less the Western borderlands of the Russian Empire in the 19th and 20th centuries. And Jews there, some Jews at least, also felt the wave of secularization and acculturation coming from the West. They were, after all, in Europe, and many of them also learned the Russian language, got to know Russian literature, but unlike French or German Jews, They could not move to capital cities to pursue education. There were tremendous limitations on that. And therefore, in those little towns, the shtetls of the Bale of Settlement in the Russian Empire, there emerged a new identity, the identity of a Jew who no longer observed Jewish religion, who was no longer interested in any religion for that matter, who acquired ideas of socialism, who became much more attracted to Russian literature than to the Yiddish past. And these people had to define themselves somehow. And they defined themselves as secular Jews. Today we take it for granted, secular Jew, and many of the participants of this webinar most probably identify themselves as secular Jews. But it was a novelty because a Jew who would not observe the biblical and Talmudic commandments for centuries would be called someone who transgresses, someone who is not loyal to Jewish tradition, which are all negative terms, Reshaim, Avaryanim, and in Hebrew. So secular Jew is a positive term. And that's how it came up in the usage of Russian Jews who lived among Ukrainians and Lithuanians and Poles who also belonged to a nationality that didn't have a state. So you can understand why the Zionist idea, the idea of creating a political entity in somewhere, not necessarily in the whole land, because there were other projects as well, it appealed to Russian Jews to a large extent. However, in Western and Central Europe, Zionism was met with tremendous hostility among Jews. In fact, the founder of the political Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, whom you could see on these pictures, let me see, well, that's Herzl. He himself was a Hungarian Jew who was largely estranged from Judaism and who suffered from incomplete acceptance. Like many assimilated, acculturated Jews, he was quite successful. He was a successful playwright and journalist, but somehow he felt anti-Semitism, which was quite real, in Vienna particularly. And he sought acceptance. He sought to be part of society, and he couldn't. So his first idea to solve the Jewish question, because at that time he was thinking in collective terms, not necessarily in individual terms. That was the time of collective solutions. So he found a solution to the Jewish problem in mass conversion to Catholicism. This idea didn't appeal either to most Jews or to the Bishop of Vienna, so it had to be dropped. And his second idea was to create a nation that would be like any other nation. And therefore, the acceptance would not be individual, or if you like, assimilation would not be individual, it would be collective. And the first Zionist Congress, as many of you know, took place in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. Why Basel? Basel, even today, doesn't have a big Jewish community. It has a relatively small Jewish community and not particularly prominent. Why Basel? Because the initial idea of the organizers of the first Zionist Congress was to hold it in Munich, which did have a big Jewish community and a very established one. But Jewish organizations in Munich and generally in Germany petitioned the government to forbid the holding of the Zionist Congress in Munich. And that's why it had to be switched to Basel, Switzerland. Why? And here we get to the issue of social reasons for the opposition. I'm trying to move this way so you could read. Yeah, that's better. So what are the social reasons for opposition to Zionism? Because it threatens integration into Western societies. Here you have French or German or British Jews who are getting a social foothold, who are getting education, who are advancing in life like citizens of the country. And here come the Zionists and tell them that they belong to another nation, that in fact they are not Frenchmen or Germans, but they are members of the Jewish nationality, that they are alien in Germany, France, or Britain. That was pretty much the same that the anti-Semites were saying in the end of the 19th century. I remind you that the Anti-Semitic League was organized in the, if I'm not mistaken, in 1882. And anti-Semitism was a respectable political idea, opposed to Jewish integration in society, and arguing that Jews don't belong. Zionists also said Jews don't belong, we belong to another country that should be created. Parallels with the anti-Semitic discourse were quite obvious, and Jews felt threatened by this incipient Zionist movement. There were other reasons as well, religious reasons. Jews for centuries lived among Christians and Muslims, and they developed certain attitudes towards their environment, shaped largely by the Talmud. I would call it pacifist, submissive, and the Zionist movement was very much against it. But the most important part, I think, the most important reason why most religious Jews, both Reform and Orthodox, opposed Zionism was the fact that it redefined what it meant to be a Jew. Traditionally, if I quote Saadia Gaon, the prominent rabbi and philosopher of the Middle Ages in Iraq and Egypt, he would say that we are a nation only to the extent that we observe divine commandments. So commandments, or if you like, Jewish practice, is what defined Jews for centuries, while Zionism argued that Jews is a nationality, and therefore religious leaders, as I repeat, both Reform and Orthodox, opposed it vigorously. They considered it a blasphemy to join the Zionist movement. There were tremendous debate, polemics against Zionism. And the most important book, I'd say, written through this century of Jewish opposition to Zionism is the one you see on the screen. It's called Vayoel Moshe. It was written by Rabbi Teitelbaum, who was the head of the Hasidic group Satmar. And it remains, I think, the most fundamental work of theological refutation of Zionism. There are other books that he wrote, but this remains, I think, a classic of Jewish anti-Zionism. And you also see on this picture a poster, actually it's in Jerusalem, against Zionist control over the Holy Land. And those of you who visited Jerusalem know that several parts, important parts of Jerusalem are occupied by the so-called ultra-Orthodox or the Haredim, and the walls and their quarters often are plastered with posters in Hebrew and other languages saying that they are not Zionists, that they're against Zionist state, and so on. So in Israel, it's a very common thing to do, as I said before, because the Zionist idea is something which threatens the traditional Jewish identity. And varieties of Jewish opposition exist and have existed. You could see on this picture a book by Jack Ross about Rabbi Elmer Berger. The title is quite telling, Rabbi Outcast. He was a Reform rabbi who was opposed to Zionism, and as the majority of Reform Jews before the Second World War. In the middle, you see, we don't know what that person, what her Jewish practice is, but she says that occupation is not Judaism, whatever way she may define Judaism. So it doesn't really matter. And on the right, you see two people, both of them no longer alive, Yasser Arafat and Rabbi Moshe Hirsch, whom I first met in 1980. He visited me in my little apartment in Jerusalem in 81. And I interviewed him then. I made a lengthy interview for the radio with him. He was a minister in the government of Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian government. And he supported, as you could see, the Palestinian liberation movement. So this was something that was quite common and still remains common among these ultra-Orthodox or Haredi groups. So we have to realize that religious opposition, independently of whether it's Reform or Orthodox, is opposed to reformulation of the Jewish identity in secular terms. In other words, Jews are a certain confessional, religious, spiritual group, if you like, but not a separate nation. And this is very important for religious kinds of opposition to Zionism. Socialist movements actually accept that Jews constitute a nation. The idea of Jewish nationality emerged, as I said, in the Russian Empire and was officialized first in the Soviet Union and then in the State of Israel. Jewish nationality is something that became an entry in your identity card, both in the Soviet Union and in Israel. Socialist movements, in fact, didn't oppose the idea of Jewish nationality, but they believed that nationalism, or they call it bourgeois nationalism, distracts Jewish masses from political struggle for justice and therefore has to be opposed. And Zionism was perceived as bourgeois nationalism by quite a few socialist movements, definitely by the Communist Party, by the Bund, which argued for socialist transformation of Jewish communities in the countries where they lived, rather than creating a different country. But as you well know, there were quite a few socialist parties in the Zionist movement. They tried to combine socialism and nationalism. A very good book by Zev Sternhell, who passed away recently, a professor at Hebrew University, wrote a book. I know in French, it exists in English and French. In French, it's Aux origines d'Israël, and in English, it's Founding Myths of Israel. I think he made a very good point that nationalism and socialism were combined in a very unnatural connection. You see here a poster of Socialist Pioneers who actually developed much of what Israel became. These pioneers, as you see, were progressive, they were emancipated, the woman clearly is emancipated, they are for equality between men and women, so they espoused quite a few socialist and progressive ideas. And at the same time, they saw that they were building a new country on socialist principles. Sternhell actually argues that socialism was used by nationalists in order to create the infrastructure for the future state. But I don't want to go into this debate and into his discussion how to call Zionism, because he says that we cannot call it national socialism because the term means something else. So we'll call it socialist nationalism. But it was a very unnatural connection. And attempts to integrate socialism and nationalism eventually failed. They failed in terms of kibbutzim that became almost privatized by now, but also particularly in this case, very natural shift from the left to the right. And you see here a picture of settlers and settler youngsters who are maltreating an Arab woman, a Palestinian woman. In fact, what we have observed, some with regret, that Israel is turning into a bastion of right-wing nationalist ideology and an example for many other countries and many other right-wing movements. Well, it was something that many socialist opponents of Zionism foresaw, and that's why they opposed Zionism as bourgeois nationalism. And there is also moral opposition, whether it's religious or secular. Israel became a very important military power, and it used violence throughout the decades of existence in order to survive and prosper in the midst of largely hostile environment. In fact, this is the predicament of many many instances of settler colonialism. And colonialism is not necessarily, I'm using not as a negative term, but the initial financial institution of the Zionist movement was called Jewish Colonial Trust. At that time, it was perfectly acceptable. So the settler colonialism always provokes hostility. When people are expelled from their own land, when they don't have real equal rights, they somehow don't like it and resist. And therefore, Israel has developed as a military camp, and to a large extent, it exists as a military camp, a very successful one in terms of military technology, but also it penetrates the very society that is becoming more and more right-wing. And you see a picture of a father showing his son, who must be 5, 6 years old, how to use a machine gun, I think. So this militarization causes tremendous rejection from those Jews who value what they consider moral principles of Judaism or Jewish moral principles. And therefore they condemn, as you see on the other picture, Jews condemn apartheid, boycott Israel, solidarity with Palestinian resistance. They do it for moral reasons. For them, Israel is not acting morally, and many of them consider that Israel is a negation of Jewish morality. And in that sense, even these secular Jews, mostly secular Jews, rejoin the arguments of Rabbi Tettelbaum, who was also saying that Zionists are doing something which is opposed to Jewish tradition and Jewish values, even though he expressed it in different terms. Zionism is also often presented as a savior, and there's a very important campaign going on in Israel for the last 20 or 30 years to bring Israelis to concentration camps in Poland to show that Israel, in fact, is a savior of the Jews. Zionism is a savior of the Jews. And the Nazi genocide justifies the creation of the State of Israel, which was the dominant discourse when Israel was established in 1948. In fact, that was the justification given by the Soviet representative at the United Nations, Andrei Gromyko, when he was supporting the Zionist project, and Soviet Union was the first country to recognize Israel and provided them with military equipment that was crucial for the survival of the young Zionist state. However, opponents to Zionism think that the Holocaust doesn't justify the occupation of Palestine. So you see, the argument is trying to negate the fact that the establishment of the State of Israel is somehow making Jews safer. Many argue that the least safe place for Jews is in fact Israel, because it may be today the only place in the world where a Jew can be killed just because he or she is a Jew, because of that resistance to the Zionist state. Jewish anti-Zionism is not popular these days, but it was never popular. I would say that Jewish opponents to Zionism didn't fear physical repression, but the first terrorist act that actually happened in Palestine was directed at a Jewish anti-Zionist, and you see him in Arab garb, Dr. Yakov M, a Dutch Jew who joined the ultra-Orthodox Anti-Zionist Alliance and was preparing a visit of rabbis to London, the mandatory power in 1924, to argue against the creation of Zionist state, the Zionist entity. He was murdered on the orders of the Zionist movement, Haganah, the Zionist military organization, in 1924. So he was the first victim of intolerance towards Jewish anti-Zionism. And on the right of this screen, you could see, even today, anti-Zionist religious Jews are treated pretty roughly by the soldiers and police. And here you see one of the conflicts. And many of you remember as well that anti-Zionism was deemed to be anti-Semitic, and it cost the career of the head of the British Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, among others. It is politically very dangerous to be openly opposed to Zionism. Even to criticize Israel is pretty dangerous, both in political circles, but I would say even academic circles, because for people who don't have tenure, it may pose some problems. I don't want to discourage people from joining whatever political movement they want, but today, the idea that was first advanced by Abba Eban, a very educated foreign minister of Israel for many years, it was his idea that anti-Zionism has to be assimilated to anti-Semitism, and therefore it would become illegitimate. And today, to a large extent, in the minds of many and in the minds of mainstream media, opposition to Zionism means anti-Semitism. But as you could see from this presentation and the books that I and many others have written on the subject, in fact, this is not so. But today, I would say the common opinion of many people is that Zionism is a natural, enjoys the natural sympathy of the Jews. I would say that in North America, more in the United States than in Canada, younger Jews are gradually becoming disaffected from Israel, from Zionism, and they look for some kind of spiritual self-fulfillment. So there is a change in that sense that is happening among Jews, and Jewish anti-Zionism perhaps becoming slightly more legitimate and better known than it was, say, 20, 30 years ago. So let me finish at this point and open the floor to questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Yakov, for this presentation, this overview of, just a second, there we go. And for this great overview of the history of Jewish anti-Zionism. I wondered if you could go back, there was something you said about, this not being a taboo subject in Israel. And and that settlers were very curious about this. Could you go into that curiosity and maybe explain it a little bit to us? Because, that it sounds very contradictory to have curious settlers of, have them curious of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism.
In fact, my interest in the subject began in an institution run by very committed Zionists, many of them settlers, in Jerusalem during one of my sabbatical years there. And I joined the seminar. It was 25, even more, I think maybe 30 years ago, on Jewish anti-Zionist thought. It was run for the Zionists and by the Zionists because for those people, particularly young people, who grew up in Israel in Zionist circles, the fact that many of the rabbis that they respected and whose names they mentioned with a lot of reverence were anti-Zionist was incomprehensible. And that's why they went to the texts. They went to understand why this phenomenon of Jewish opposition to Zionism was so widely spread. So we studied those texts for about 5-6 months. And then when I went back to Israel with my book, with the Hebrew edition of my book, the radio station Arutz Sheva called me and asked me to give them an interview about the book. And they were very polite, very interested, because for them, again, for the new generation, 30 years have passed, for the new generation, particularly of the settlers in the West Bank who are so committed to their Zionist idea, and they believe that they're doing something very appropriate in terms of Jewish tradition. They are observant Jews, they're religious Jews. And all of a sudden, when they discovered that the vast majority of rabbis, important rabbis of the 20th century, were against, and many of them still are against. For them, it was important to understand that for the same reason as the organizers of the seminar. And what I emphasized in the interview, which was broadcast live, they didn't even try to edit what I was saying. For them, it was important to understand the main principles of that opposition. And it opens up a very important debate in Israel among the religious Jews, among the so-called religious Zionists, and the secular majority of Israel. This is very useful because the book, I'm not boasting, but I'd say the book was received in Israel a lot better than it was in Canada. In Canada, it's largely a taboo subject because, it's
a very conservative Jewish community.
In most, I would say, in the mainstream media. In the mainstream media, and not necessarily Jewish. If you don't want to have an avalanche of letters in your newspaper, you don't publish anti-Zionist texts. And actually, I wrote my impressions of that presentation in both National Post and Le Devoir. And National Post published it because I was praising Israel for freedom of the speech, which we don't seem to have here on this subject.
I'm just going to go into one of these questions. You mentioned, the link between religious anti-Zionism, secular anti-Zionism. Is there a link? Do they speak to each other? What's the level of coordination, as it's been asked here, between those two?
Well, I think there are some connections. We are not talking about a party or political movement. We are talking about groups that are opposed to certain issues. For example, just to return to that trip to Israel when I was presenting my book, on the second day that I was in Israel, my publisher calls me and says, Yakov, did you organize this? I say, what? Open the television. I say, open the television, and I see a sea of black coats at the entrance to Jerusalem, 500,000 of them, protesting against military draft. You see, for most Israelis, it was really difficult to understand why these people protest against military draft. So I went on television in Israel to explain why it happened, because for most of them, they didn't want to join the Zionist majority of Israel. It's not that they were particularly pacifist. Some of them are, some aren't, but they really don't want to join the mainstream. And joining the army is, of course, joining the mainstream. So, of course, there are some groups now that are being integrated, and it's a very important objective of the Israeli government, of the Israeli establishment, is to integrate these Jews into the Zionist mainstream, because this is the most demographically dynamic group in Israel among Jews. So you have to respect what they're doing. So that's one. And there are some in that crowd of black coats, there were also people who were pretty much secular, without kippah, without any religious garb. For me, it was an illustration that there are some connections between secular,
the secular and the religious component,
and the religious. So they may, you see, it's very interesting, because, and I say that in my book, they come from very different horizons, but they end up saying pretty much the same thing. That Zionism is not Jewish.
Zionism is not Jewish, yes. We have a situation in Canada where, those of us in Independent Jewish Voices and others, JVP, we have a very difficult relationship with, as you call them, the black coats, or the Orthodox non-Zionist Jews. And it's not an easy relationship, because in a sense, they represent the religious, the traditional Judaism, which is an anathema to secular Jews who are anti-Zionist. Do you have, how can we, go about improving that relationship in terms of, a Jewish response to Zionism?
Well, I'm not a good political organizer. I don't think I have any advice.
No, we need the thoughts you have in order to better politically organize, is what we're getting at.
Even though I'm one of the founding members of the
voilà.
But I still am not terribly good organizer. What I can say is that it's important to establish cooperation on issues.
Okay.
On certain issues, rather than an overall. Overall, you see, for most people in IJV, there exists a secular Jewish nationality. Most of them identify as secular Jews. Obviously, that these ultra-Orthodox Jews don't accept this. So you have a real problem there of the definition of what is a Jew. However, on certain issues, you can cooperate. And I think that's the easiest way to deal with that. For example, the protest against the draft to the Israeli army, which there was a huge demonstration in New York about against that, of ultra-Orthodox Jews, and there were some secular Jews there as well, who were also opposed to Israeli militarism and so on. So on certain issues you can cooperate, but indeed the self-definition of what it means to be a Jew are diametrically opposed to each other.
But as you said, it's a self-definition, but that's a whole other issue. So, okay. Zionism, being a Western nationalist ideology, it has fanned the flames of what I'm going to call inter-Jewish racism, whether it's here or in Israel. can you give us a little bit of the history, a little bit of a historical context when it comes to that particular relationship or lack of?
Well, that's why one of my slides was called European Project.
Yes, right.
And it's important to understand that Zionism, to the extent it responded to the needs of Jews, and largely, again, I say in the Russian Empire at that time, was a European ideology of colonization, which was perfectly acceptable. Also creating a European enclave, whether it would be in Uganda or in Palestine, but it was to be a European enclave. And I refer you to Theodor Herzl's book, Alt-Neuland, which is very clear about the idea of creating an enlightened European society. This was totally alien to Jews living in non-European societies.
Right.
So it's no surprise that in the 30s, among the members of the World Zionist Organization, which was a very mass movement at that time, the non-European Jews, I mean non-European including non-Ashkenazi Jews, let's put it this way, the Jews from countries of Islam, majority Islam countries, constituted 0.37% of the membership. That is about 1/3%. I think that tells you all about the popularity of that movement among so-called Oriental or Sephardic Jews. So indeed, when Israel was created, there was a debate whether these Jews should be encouraged to come to Israel. But they were the natural reservoir of Zionist settlers were massacred by the Nazis in Europe. So they had to resort to those Jews and they tried to make them into good Israelis.
Ashkenazi Jews.
Yeah, there's even in Hebrew a verb, Ushkenaz, someone who was Ashkenazized, so to speak.
Ashkenazized.
Yeah, but indeed, it's a serious problem within Israel itself. Division between Jews of sort of Arab,
Mizrahi, Sephardim, etc.
Yeah. But even the terminology is so Orientalist that when I say Oriental, I immediately correct myself because. A Jew coming from Novosibirsk considers a Jew from Casablanca an Oriental. Now look at the map.
Voilà. Oui. No, en effet, the conversation is, it has to continue. I have a question here. You talked about the younger Jews today. And here is a question about this. And how can young Jews and emerging Jewish leaders who are committed to anti-Zionism work within existing American Jewish institutions and communities to shift the conversation and assumptions made by mainstream American Jews? How can they shift that conversation? Can you, as I said in the beginning, your work and all of this history is part of a context we need in order to have, to better hone our tools. And I think that's what's being asked here.
Well, it must be, as they call it, déformation professionnelle, but I think education is the key. Education is indeed the key because for many Jews, that Zionism equals their kind of Judaism. In many synagogues, you have Israeli flags, and for people, it's perfectly natural. And they don't think too much about it. I mean, it's a natural thing to do. So you need education, and you need also activism within Jewish communities, because I didn't mention it, but it's a natural question that someone could have posed. How did it happen that American Jews who were largely opposed to Zionism, most American Jewish organizations were opposed, and then they became sympathetic and supporters? What happened?
Can you answer?
What happened? There was a gradual shift in the leadership of those organizations. So these were organizations originally, say, beginning of the 20th century, when Zionist movement was gathering steam, they were largely run by very established German Jews who arrived in the United States in the mid-19th century, who made it, and who, of course, abhorred Zionism. For them, it was something totally unacceptable. However, with the wave of millions of East European Jews, a change began. A change didn't begin in the organizations because they were still controlled by this very respectable German Jews. But gradually, those Russian Jews made it financially, became very active in Jewish organizations, and replaced that Jewish-German hierarchy.
The bourgeoisie, oui.
And so that's how the replacement happened. So perhaps something of the sort is possible with more and more, how would I say, visible Jews like Peter Beinart, to give you one example, finally said that he doesn't embrace the idea of the Zionist state. And so you have a lot of that going on. And I think that honestly, with the generational change and activism on the part of those Jews who want to operate this change, things may happen. It's also, political environment may also be propitious, because, I was really surprised a few days ago when I opened the Washington Post. The first big article was against Israeli discrimination against Palestinians in terms of vaccination.
Yes.
For Washington Post, it's highly unusual to articulate this kind of criticism. So I think there is something in the political change going south of our border that may be propitious for this kind of activity.
One thing we hear quite often from younger Jews is they don't know how to speak to these questions. They're very difficult questions. We know that, we know this over the last how many decades of dealing with this particular issue. Without being called anti-Semitic, without being called a Jew self-hater. I know we've all heard of this. Is there something that you can, as they would say in journalistic language, is there a crochet? Is there something that you can give them as a place where to start from when they first want to empower themselves, but how to continue how to start the conversation with their families, within their communities? It's a very difficult first step to take.
Well, again, I would say that a historical argument may be important, but also I would argue for respect of those sensitivities that they encounter in the family or in other Jewish circles. For many Jews, Israel and Zionism is the foundation of their Jewish life. They don't observe kosher food, they don't observe Shabbat, but they give money to Israel, or they'll go there for 2 weeks. They're ardently committed to it as part of their identity, not as a political option, not as a hobby. It's what they are. They start their day by reading Jerusalem Post. They know everything that goes on in Israel. It's vicarious Zionism, if you like, or vicarious Israelism. So you have to recognize it's a fact. You may like it, you may dislike it, it's a fact. So I think one way of doing it is to show that there are other kinds of being Jewish.
Interesting.
Other ways of being Jewish. And I would say for many people who consider themselves non-Zionist and anti-Zionist, and particularly those who are active in Palestinian solidarity, this activity may be the only Jewish thing they do.
Now that's what a lot of people who call us anti-Semitic will say as well. On the other.
So I would, I'm not here to preach, but I think it's very important to acquire credibility at least, but also for just existential reasons, if you like, to do other Jewish things, whatever they may be. For some people it would be becoming observant, for others it would be helping the poor, for third it would be something else. There are myriad ways of being Jewish. I'm not arguing for one or the other, but I think it's very important to be active in other Jewish pursuits, and then your voice will be heard.
Okay, I'm going to be a devil's advocate. I mean, IJV is rooted precisely their work on the human rights issues, peace and justice issues, are anchored in Jewish tradition. Why would that not be enough? Well, in terms of,
look, again,
because Jewish history is not simply is not just a history of religious beliefs and how would I say, following the religious laws, etc. This is not.
No, I'm well aware of it. That's not the issue. I think that, well, again, I don't want to give political advice because I'm not a good person to do it. But if you, even around the Passover Seder table, and if there's a discussion of Israel Zionism, which often may come up, particularly, the text itself offers itself as a subject of discussion. You can say, well, let's see how it was interpreted in the tradition. You don't have to be Orthodox, but you have to be educated. See, this is the issue. In other words, if, I remember once I was speaking at the Jewish venue, and they were building this wall in Israel between Palestine and Israel, what some people call apartheid wall. And I said, there's a very interesting Rashi. Rashi is a medieval Jewish commentator on the episode in the Bible where the explorers of the land come back with their report and they say, oh, the giants live there. They're very strong and they have fortified cities with walls. And the Rashi, a medieval French Jewish commentator, says, people who build walls are not strong.
Marvelous. Okay, very well said. I have a small question coming in here. Actually, it seems to come in a thread, which is, can you give us the difference between anti-Zionist, the term anti-Zionist, as opposed to non-Zionist? Is there for you a distinction between those?
Well, I think I'm a non-Zionist. I don't.
Not an anti-Zionist, though, are you?
No, I don't think it's a great idea, but I don't participate in demonstrations. I don't do anything political. I explain to people what Zionism is and what opposition to Zionism is. But I think anti-Zionists are people who are actively doing something.
And non-Zionist? I mean, if anti-Zionist is a political definition, what would...
The non-Zionist, they just don't identify with this particular political idea.
Okay. All right.
And do other things. Then you could do whatever, Jewish renewal. You can do other things that you consider Jewish without even relating to Israel one way or the other. Because I think one of the problems, again, there's a certain sort of paradoxical symmetry between those people for whom defending Israel in quotation marks, writing letters to newspapers and Radio Canada and all that, that's their only Jewish thing. And the others for whom criticizing Israel is the only Jewish thing. So I think diversification would help a dialogue.
Diversification. I think we're rather diverse, but that's another question. I have a question here.
Diversification of Jewish expressions.
Merci. Ah, ça c'est, okay. Right. Bon, there is a question here. Why have national non or anti-Zionist organizations who support Palestinian rights in the US, Canada, and European countries, why have they showed up in the last 10 or 15 years? What made them more able to resist together and grow in the near recent times? Why are they more able to resist together now than they were before the last 20 years?
I didn't get what movements are you talking about?
The national non or anti-Zionist organizations who support Palestinian rights.
Why they have been successful?
Yeah, in the last 10 years to 15 years.
Well, I think there's a confluence of factors. One is a changing, generational change among Jews.
Mm-hmm.
The younger Jews become more active. That's very natural. They become older and become active. Then the second one is that Israel has become much more sort of Israeli establishment has become much more outspoken and explicit in affirming what Israel is. Because I mentioned Abba Eban, who was a wonderfully sweet-tongued foreign minister. He was so progressive in his language that he really forgot what was going on the ground. Today, Israeli leaders are very explicit. It's our land. They passed this nationality law. They don't hide what they're doing. They are much more assertive as right-wing nationalists. And for many Jews, it's not acceptable. So to reject Abba Eban and Ben Gurion was more difficult than to reject Bibi Netanyahu, who is today, I would say, the leftist in his own government.
Voilà. On a une question ici de Pierre Stamboul, je crois que vous le connaissez, Yakov. Alors, il dit, il n'y a pas de paradoxe ici quand on regarde l'État sioniste qui est suprémaciste. Il est allié à tous les antisémites, donc Trump, Orban, Bolsonaro, on le sait, et plusieurs dirigeants sionistes ont été proches des fascistes. Et ils arrivent à accuser d'antisémitisme ceux qui les critiquent. Est-ce que vous pouvez en parler un petit peu? C'est sur le côté paradoxal de cette situation.
Bon, je crois que effectivement, Pierre Stamboul a parfaitement raison que dès ses origines, dès Herzl, en fait, le lien entre le mouvement sioniste et les antisémites était très étroit, parce que leurs opinions étaient parallèles. Les antisémites voulaient débarrasser l'Europe de cette contagion juive, tandis que les sionistes voulaient les transporter en Ouganda ou en Palestine, donc, peu importe. Donc sur ce plan-là, il y avait justement cette confluence d'intérêts, cette confluence de discours aussi, parce que pour les deux, les Juifs étaient un corps étranger en Europe.
Oui, carrément. Oui.
C'est très clair. Donc, maintenant, la situation est différente dans le sens que les leaders que vous avez mentionnés, Orban, Trump, etc., ils sont les plus pro-israéliens. Oui. Et Trump a reproché aux Juifs américains qu'ils ne sont pas des bons Juifs. Donc, vous voyez, Trump a dit aux Juifs américains qui appuient le Parti démocrate en grande majorité qu'ils ne sont pas des bons Juifs parce que regardez ce que j'ai fait pour Israël et vous ne m'appuyez pas.
Wow. Oui.
Donc, aujourd'hui, les groupes antisémites en Europe et ailleurs sont probablement les plus pro-israéliens. Et pourquoi ils sont les plus pro-israéliens? Parce qu'ils sont souvent islamophobes, anti-arabes, et qui vénèrent le pouvoir militaire. Israël, bon, il y a de quoi vénérer. Israël est vraiment un formidable acteur militaire. Donc, disons, c'est le super macho.
Les suprémacistes, il y a un lien assez étroit et compréhensible.
Oui, donc moi j'ai écrit même un article From Left to Right, comment Israël a bougé justement dans son discours et comment ça a attiré les groupes qui anciennement était neutre par rapport à Israël, ou était même négatif, et ils sont devenus des plus grands admirateurs d'Israël. Israël est devenu vraiment l'exemple de comment il faut vivre, comment il faut construire une société ségrégée.
Moi, j'ai un peu de difficulté lorsqu'on dit de left to the right, parce que je ne sais pas si on peut considérer l'idéologie sioniste comme étant de gauche. Enfin,
je dis que...
Même la pratique sioniste coloniale n'était pas de gauche.
J'ai cité Zev Steinhell qui a écrit tout un livre, donc tout ça c'est connu. Mais le mouvement sioniste était en majorité jusqu'à 77 en tout cas, pratiquait plus ou moins un genre de socialisme économique parmi les juifs.
Parmi les juifs, ok, je suis
d'accord.
d'accord.
Parmi les juifs ashkénazes, donc c'est encore mieux. Donc c'était une société qui était relativement égalitaire. Sur ce plan-là, on peut dire que c'était une société qui avait une idéologie de gauche en matière de socialisme pour les juifs, disons comme ça. Bon, c'est que le socialisme nationaliste, disait Sternhell.
Okay.
Voilà, donc tout cela s'est transformé maintenant d'une façon beaucoup plus organique en une économie néolibérale outrée avec le niveau d'inégalité sociale
exacerbé, merci.
Plus proche, tout près des États-Unis. Et donc, maintenant, je crois que la société israélienne est beaucoup plus organique parce qu'il n'y a plus de contradiction entre l'idéologie nationaliste et la pratique économique. Les deux sont de droite. Les deux vont de pair et c'est peut-être pour cela qu'on n'a plus besoin de prétendre qu'Israël est un pays socialiste, ce qui était reconnu par le mouvement socialiste.
Auparavant, oui.
Auparavant.
J'ai une autre question, là c'est en anglais. I know you said that anti-Zionism is not a taboo topic in Israel, but how are anti-Zionist Jews received in Israel? We see reports of young Israelis doing prison time for serving to refuse in the IDF due to their anti-occupation stance. And I can add to that, also from the international point of view, going to Israel as when you are a non-Zionist Jew is not an easy situation at all.
True. I think that the state of Israel has become much more assertive in the last few years, really, in terms of forbidding critics of Israel to come to Israel. They have become much more emboldened by support from the United States and from, I would say, most Western governments. But within Israeli society, the anti-Zionist discourse is still not considered taboo. And I'll give you just one anecdote. Well, I'll give you one anecdote, not from a university campus, but something else, because that's where society really is. I was riding in a taxi in Jerusalem to interview an anti-Zionist rabbi for my book. It was over 20 years ago. And I was late. And at that time, I didn't have a cell phone, but the driver did. And I says, could you call, because I'm late for the appointment, could you call that we are stuck in a traffic jam? Mm-hmm. He says, sure. What's the number? I gave him a number. He dialed it. I says, whom shall I ask? I say, Rabbi Hirsch. Oh, from Arafat. I say, yes, from Arafat. Then the rabbi answers, and the way he addresses him, the driver, Kavod Arav, Your Honor, the Rabbi.
Ah bon, okay.
And I'm sure that cab driver was not a tremendous anti-Zionist, to put it mildly. Most probably he votes for Likud and all that. But there was a respect. There's a respect to a certain degree. Of course, there is the same Zev Sternhell, who was not an anti-Zionist, but he was a critic of Zionism, received death threats. There was a bomb planted at his doorstep. So these things do happen. And I think most probably they will happen more because Israeli society is moving to much more assertive right-wing nationalism.
Yes.
And therefore, tolerance will be diminishing. Well, I'm not a prophet, I don't know. But so to answer this question, well, there are all kinds of trends, but within Israeli society, people are perfectly aware that there is anti-Zionism and that it exists.
When it comes to a common cause against anti-Zionism, there is a question here. There's often, you know, how would I say, link between religious and secular anti-Zionists because of homophobic, transphobic, and the sexist attitudes toward women. Okay, do you see this as a problem for the common cause against Zionism? I hope I expressed that question well.
No, you expressed it perfectly well. Look, we're talking about two different worlds who cooperate within very different parameters. And if you're going to try to find common ground in the way these people live and the way you live, well, you'll have difficulty. And the way, and again, I'm not saying that the ultra-Orthodox necessarily don't treat women well. Again, it's there are all kinds of families and all that. But it's important to cooperate on issues and not on overarching kind of political or social movement. Of course, they're very different. Of course, most don't accept homosexuality. Most don't accept women as equal partners in Jewish religious life. Of course, that's the case. I mean, it's not a secret. But you want to cooperate on certain issues, and you have to do it pragmatically or politically, if you like. Politically meaning
politically.
You agree on certain things and you don't agree on others, and you try to cooperate on those you agree on. Because if you're going to look for a mirror image of yourself, well, you can cooperate with yourself.
Oh, all of these questions could take us into much longer discussions. We are well advanced in time, Yakov. I'd like to end with this one question, which I think might give us, which I think sort of sums up a bit of what we're discussing here. If you set aside religion, and if you set aside Israel, is there anything else which defines the Jewish people? So, in other words, you know, if the person is not religious, if they don't accept if they're anti-Zionist or non-Zionist and do not accept Israel as it is today, what's left for Jewish people?
Well, you see, the term religion is a very nebulous term. For many people, it means values. It means moral values.
Okay.
It means a certain way of behavior. It means certain culture. And it means, for example, someone who is committed to, I don't know, the propagation of the Yiddish language, or someone who is interested in Jewish music of certain Jewish communities. This is their way of being Jewish. But finally, I don't give any prescriptions. I think the question is, how can you be Jewish without being religious or Zionist?
Oh, or Zionist, yes.
Or Zionist. Well, I think it is a challenge. I think it is a challenge. But some Jews actually identified as Jews for a generation or two, like Jewish socialists here in Montreal, who founded the first trade union in Montreal, which was Yiddish speaking. You know, that's something. So you had, but again, that identity could not be perpetuated. You see, the difference, I would say, is that they founded schools that were theoretically Jewish socialist schools here in Montreal. I'm just giving an example. And the founders were committed Jewish socialists. They were active in trade unions. They were doing all the right things. Now, third generation after that, the school exists, or existed till very recently. And you see parents driving their children in BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes and Lexuses. They are clearly not trade union activists. So
it's a caricatural picture, but I accept it for now.
No, well, I've seen it really.
Yeah.
And I think that, again, people have to find them I think one only can define it for oneself. There are no prescriptions. If they want prescriptions, of course, there exist. There's a tradition. For me personally, what opened my eyes on what it meant to be a Jew, and I grew up in the Soviet Union where I didn't receive any Jewish education at all, was a book by Jacob Katz, Out of the Ghetto, about the acculturation of Jews in Western Europe. Even though I came from Eastern Europe, but it opened my eyes on what it meant to be a Jew. For some other people, it may be some other text or some other encounter or some other music. Again, I'm not giving any prescriptions, but it has to be an active search. This I do say, because if you sit down and do nothing, of course, nothing is going to happen.
Therefore, our work as anti-Zionism, anti-Zionists, or non-Zionists, is also an active expression of our Judaism. And I want to thank you immensely for all of this that you have been able to give us, and thank everyone for all of you for your participation. Je voudrais vous remercier d'abord, Yakov, pour, je dirais, l'importance de tout ce que vous avez dit, de tout ce que vous avez pu partager avec nous. Et je voudrais aussi vous remercier tous et toutes de votre participation, et vous pouvez trouver ce webinaire sur notre page Facebook de Voix juive indépendante, IJV Canada. On IJV Canada, you will find this webinar on our Facebook page. It is also available on YouTube, and you will find all of this information at www.ijvcanada.org. Merci beaucoup, Yakov.
Mon plaisir. À bientôt.
À bientôt, on espère.